what I thought I would do is to try to give you a guide on how to read the book, if you decide to read it. Rather than summarize, what I thought I would do is to perhaps give you two ways of looking at it. One could read our book as an example of an aberration, an example of a hybrid regime that has achieved characteristics that are very difficult to find throughout Latin America. The extent to which the concentration of power has taken place, the control over the economy, the amount of social spending is so superlative, and I could go on and on and on about all the things that are so Venezuelan or so Chavistas or so petrostate-like, that you could really, enjoy this book as a work on an aberration, a case that is so atypical that that makes it worth the read. And there are many reasons for having that kind of reading on Venezuela. But I may want to suggest that you could also read the book as an example of some of the tendencies in Latin American politics that you can find throughout, even in countries that are not petrostates or high middle income countries, or who even have a left-wing revolutionary government. Some of the things that we're seeing in Venezuela are trends elsewhere. So let me do that exercise for you, and then as a way to have more to discuss during the Q&A period. Let me just say one thing. Let me just take, for example, the topic of the investments in social policy, which, as Edwin said, has been huge. Now, again, we can explain this as the result of Venezuela being a petrostate. It has the money to do it, and it does it. Expensive. But one of the things that we argue in the book, that one of the reasons that there is a lot of social spending in Venezuela is precisely because this is not yet an autocracy. It is an electoral, it's still an electoral, perhaps autocracy, but there are elections. And as in Latin America in the 2000s, the literature that compares democratic with autocratic regimes will tell you that democracies tend to take better care of social issues precisely because of the electoral competition. And so one could see this at full play in Venezuela. In 2003, when Chavez was in his most dangerous moment, that's when he came up with the idea, I gotta spend for the poor. And this has been documented in many democracies. One reason why many democracies often do better with poverty alleviation is precisely because they have electoral competition. The ruling party, the state, has to compete. And in Venezuela, you see that phenomenon happening, and we accept it. And it's one of the reasons why Michael and I will not go as far as many colleagues of ours in declaring the regime a full-blown autocracy, because one aspect that is very important in democracy, which is the day on the election, you have to compete and you have to sweat for those votes, has been allowed to exist with the kind of predictable effect of social spending goes up. So that's one area where you see how Venezuela is less idiosyncratic and more part of a trend. Another point is, even though we don't say it's an autocracy, Michael Penfold and I call it a hybrid regime, a mixture. I have already been criticized for this term meaning nothing, being too ambivalent, being whatever. The point that we want to say is that it's neither. It has elements of autocracy, and many elements of autocracy, as well as elements of democracy. And very few cases in Latin America today could be qualified as hybrid to the same degree as Venezuela. Okay, that's the special part. But you could also look at what's happening in Venezuela as a study on what is discussed in the literature in political science as the incumbent's advantage. In other words, what you see is a phenomenon that we are seeing in other countries, and that is the president, by staying more and more time in office, tends to accumulate enough institutional resources to be able to perpetuate himself or herself in office. And so in many ways, this is an extreme version of this. Let me just give you very sobering statistics for Latin America. If you exclude Jamaica and Suriname, and you look at all the Latin American countries, except in a tiny Caribbean nation, and not looking at Jamaica and Suriname, you will see that about 16 incumbent presidents have been re-elected. In other words, presidents trying to run for office, and only 2 have been defeated. In other words, when the incumbent is allowed to run, in Latin America, he or she wins big time. If you include Cristina Kirchner, the number goes up a little bit. I've included also as an incumbent's advantage. And in many ways, the book allows you to understand why is it that even as things don't look so shiny economically, the incumbents wins. And this is typical in Latin America. I was talking to Barbara and I was saying that the notion of term limits, which is fundamental in presidential democracies, was invented in Latin America in the 19th century precisely as a constitutional solution to the problem of, it was called caudillismo, now we call it the incumbent's advantage in a democracy. And this ill, I think it's an ill, is very common in Latin America as well, and it's one of the reasons why one could read the book as an example of a very Latin American case. All right, another area, in the management of the economy, the specialness of Venezuela. The number of nationalizations is extraordinary. About 400 or so we have more or less counted. None of the leftist regimes in Latin America have nationalized or reverted many of the privatizations of the 2000. None come close. So in that sense, here you have the special case. But you could also look at this as the fact that the 2000 for Latin America was an area in which you see the return of fiscal activism, the return of more state presence, and this is never polemical. And this is what you may want to take from this. If you remember in the 2000, every privatization was scrutinized by the domestic citizenry, by the press, by the courts, like, whew. Yet the encroachment of the state, the way that states have become very involved, the credits that state banks are giving out in Brazil, for example, the millions of contracts have not been politicized in Latin America in the 2000s. It's very similar. In other words, this does not become an issue over which civil society or even the opposition run their campaigns on. And so it shows that there continues to be a certain demand or acceptance for statism. In the Venezuelan case, it's what we call statism on steroids. In other cases, you don't have it on steroids, but you do have the trend in Latin America that the return of the state has come with a lot of acceptance and very little scrutiny. And on foreign affairs, again, the special case, Chavez has invested in foreign affairs like very few global South nations. One estimate says that almost 1.5% of Venezuela's gross national income has been invested in its foreign policy. To give you a comparison, China invests 0.08% of its income. Saudi Arabia doesn't come close in terms of this. Venezuela is a massive foreign aid giver, the quintessential case of the new South-to-South forms of aid.